Okay, welcome everybody. I'd like to get started. I know there's still some people dribbling up from the cafe, but I want to stay on time. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to give you a heads up on the upcoming talks in this lecture series. In 2 weeks, we have Mary Woolley, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer of Research America. For those of you who don't know Mary, she's a fantastic person, very important on the national scene at advocating for health and biomedical research funding, very articulate voice for the health sciences and biomedical sciences, and a great communicator with the public in general. So we're really fortunate to have her. And then immediately the week after her, on April 12th, we'll be having Pete Rosenbaum here, who's talking about disabilities in the 21st century. He's the Canada Research Chair in Childhood Disability at McMaster University. And then immediately, well, not immediately, a few weeks after that, in May, we'll be having Elder Shafir visiting. He'll be talking about behavioral economic approaches to reasoning, judgment, and decision-making, also from Princeton University. So it'll be a nice follow-on to tonight's speaker as well. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome everybody to the VTCRI Distinguished Public Lecture. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have Dr. John Cohen from Princeton University. Dr. Cohen is the Robert and Lynn Bendheim Thoman Professor in Neuroscience, and he's also the founding co-director of the Princeton Neuroscience Institute. Dr. Cohen did his undergraduate work at Yale, his medical degree at University of Pennsylvania, and his Ph.D. at Carnegie Mellon in cognitive psychology. He then went on to do a residency in psychiatry at Stanford University and also did a research fellowship there in behavioral sciences. And then he joined the faculty at the University of Pittsburgh and also at Carnegie Mellon before he moved to Princeton as professor of psychology and has been the founding director there of the Princeton Center for the Study of Brain, Mind, and Behavior before the founding co-directorship of the Princeton Neuroscience Institute, which is a great program that he directs. Dr. Cohen has won numerous awards for his research. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just a couple. He has won the Stanford Miller Foundation Prize for Psychiatric Research, the Sasher Award from Columbia School of Medicine. He's a fellow of the AAAS, American Psychology Association Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award recipient, a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, etc. So as you can tell, he obviously is extremely highly thought of by his peers and colleagues and leaders around the country and around the world. His publications are numerous, and many of them in extremely important and high-impact journals, including a whole bunch in Science and Nature, and a number of translational and medical journals as well. His early work was on the pharmacological treatment, developing and identifying pharmacological treatments for schizophrenia. He had a paper in Science in 1990 developing a network model for the brain for catecholamine effects on behavior for neuromodulation in schizophrenia, that very important paper at the time in the field. He's been very early on in the use and application of functional imaging, fMRI, which I'm sure we'll hear a bit about, in psychological research. He's studied dopamine fluctuations in schizophrenia, been involved with mapping of the human brain with MRI in a whole bunch of areas, including visualizing working memory and studying spatial and selective attention. He has translated this work and applied it to understanding mechanisms of cognitive control in a variety of psychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia and depression. He's shown us how older adults have less impulsive decision-making due to reduced sensitivity in their brain to reward signals in the brain as compared to younger folks through dopaminergic modulation. And with some of our colleagues here, Reed Montague and others, he's been involved in some of the early studies, development, and implementation of hyperscanning, that is the ability to scan simultaneously people in MRIs and study social interactions, a real boon to the study of social interactions. He's contributed in areas of economic decision-making using the ultimatum game, where he found that unfair offers can activate both emotional processing and cognitive processing areas of the brain. So Dr. Cohen is truly recognized as a thought leader, theoretician, and experimentalist in understanding interactions between cognitive control and emotional processing and decision-making, and understanding neurobiological mechanisms of cognitive control that manifest in psychiatric disease as well. He's really been involved with visioning the use of computational approaches like machine learning, parallel computing, and algorithm optimization to functional imaging analysis. In his computational work on cognitive control of the brain's central executive supervising system is providing many new insights into how our brains represent tasks, planning, how we maintain working memory, et cetera. So as you can tell, he's made and is making major contributions in cognitive neuroscience. So we're really pleased to have him here today. Tonight he's going to share his insights on the capacity for cognitive control, a defining characteristic of human cognition. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Cohen.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Can you hear me okay? Normally, I don't use the mic because I can project, in fact, probably over-project my voice, or so I'm told by my family. But in this case, I'm still sort of battling off the vestiges of a cold, and so I apologize that my voice is a little feeble. I hope it doesn't get much more feeble. And I'll do my best to deflect when I'm sort of succumb to the, and fail to exercise control over my urge to cough. So it's really an honor to be here, especially given the list of distinguished speakers that you have in this series. It's also a privilege. It's always a privilege, and I never sort of pass up the opportunity to go somewhere that Mike and Reed, long-standing friends and colleagues, invite me to go, because I think of them as sort of a Lewis and Clark of neuroscience. Wherever they're going, everybody else is going to be going soon, both geographically and intellectually. And so, invited down here to see, I'm sad to say I have not been able to get down here yet, and since they arrived, which I know wasn't yesterday, but it's great to see the new shop that they've set up and the incredible people that they've managed to surround themselves by again, which is always, again, a sort of a hallmark of their presence. And you all who are here should really be lucky that you have these guys here, because they're the best there is in neuroscience. So thank you for inviting me and showing me what you're up to. I hope I don't disappoint you, because I'm not going to show any fMRI images. I'm not going to talk about imaging at all. Well, maybe one slide I'll say something about implications of what I am going to talk about for imaging. I'm not even going to talk about the brain that much. But I am going to talk about something, as a psychologist essentially, that has been perplexing psychology for almost half a century, and me for at least a chunk of that time, I'm afraid to say, that I think has profound significance, not only for how we think about how the mind thinks, but reflects how thinking about it in a way that respects the architecture of the brain, if not every last synapse, or biophysical detail of the brain, can illuminate us into how people think. And frankly, in this case, I think may even help illuminate those who are trying to build artificial systems, because I think some of the things I'm going to talk about actually have consequences that transcend the medium in which intelligence is built and are fundamental to what it means to have an intelligent machine that's based on network computation. And in particular, I mean sort of guiding the future of machine learning, which is finally starting to take some lessons from neuroscience for real. And I think what I'm going to talk about today, I hope, is another example of that kind of lesson that can inform our ability to build artificial machines. So I'll come back to that at the end. So here's one of the 3 or 4 titles of the talk. I haven't really settled on what the best way to describe this is. But it's an attempt to understand a characteristic of a faculty we have, cognitive control, that, as I said a few minutes ago, has perplexed the field for almost half a century. But let me start by saying what I mean by cognitive control, because I understand this is a mixed audience. I'll do my best to sort of walk that fine line between keeping everybody who's not a technical person along for the ride, but not totally boring, I hope, to people who know something about this, and tell you something that might, whet your that might satisfy your appetite for learning something new in a domain you're familiar with. So let me, though, start by defining control, so we're all sort of on the same page. And here's a fairly broad, but I hope not vacuous definition. It's the ability to flexibly guide behavior in accord with internally represented goals or intentions, and it's usually brought into relief when that ability is required to overcome some otherwise compelling response tendency. And the example that I've come to really like in describing this is a rather pedestrian one, but I think it brings the construct into pretty nice relief. And that is, if I were to sort of tickle you with a feather, or maybe notice that you have a mosquito bite, and then instruct you not to scratch, right? You may or may not decide that you're going to comply, but the fact is you could, right? And that is a remarkable fact. It's remarkable for 2 reasons. First of all, with really just 2 words, don't scratch, a half a second to get that encoded on your tympanic membrane at some fluctuations, a few action potentials along a few synapses, and you're doing something that you may never have done before, right? That's a remarkable degree of flexibility. What's even more remarkable is the thing that you're doing, or in this case not doing, is countermanding somewhere between 10 and 100 million years of evolution. So your genes encode, literally encode that tendency to want to scratch, that overwhelming or that compelling response tendency. And yet with 2 words, half a second, and a few action potentials, you can totally override 10 to 100 million years of evolution and do something you've never done before. That's unique to the human species, as far as we know. I don't know whether if we learn whalese or dolphinese, we'll be able to get them to do it, but that's about the only possibility left, because people have tried with every other species that we've been able to get in the lab and train. Parrots, monkeys, rats. And you can train those species not to scratch. I don't know if anybody's ever tried that, but it certainly seems imaginable. Excuse me, but it'll take thousands of trials, weeks, months, maybe even years of training. Okay? With 2 words, half a second, and a few action potentials, you can do it. And that we don't see anywhere else in any other species. And so that's not only meant to give you a sense of what I mean by cognitive control, but to make the point that it's something that, at least in its extreme form, is unique to humans. We can study aspects of control in rats and monkeys and other species. And I don't want you to come away thinking that I think that we're the only species that has cognitive control. But in the form that I've described it, the remarkable flexibility with which we can exercise it or deploy it to do things we've never done before, that we have not found in any other species yet. So it not only lies at the heart of our normal faculties, it also seems to be centrally involved in virtually every psychiatric disorder that has been described and studied. And that's not surprising because, excuse those of you who study psychiatric disorders in the laboratories or in animal models, but I think even you would agree, we don't really have an animal model of any psychiatric disorder in its fullest form. We have models of aspects of a disorder that show behavioral profiles that may be similar to what you see in psychiatric disorders, but nobody's ever been able to find a schizophrenic monkey or a schizophrenic rat. Right? Maybe depressed through learned helplessness, but then again, it's usually some aspect and not the full spectrum. Right? And it wouldn't be surprising if at the heart of these diseases is something that is, characteristic, if not unique to humans. So the fact that it's impaired in psychiatric illnesses almost, across the board is another indicator that it's something that is something that's specific to humans, at least in the form that we exhibit it. Excuse me. So we don't go around in the laboratory tickling people and telling them not to scratch for lots of reasons. Probably IRBs wouldn't even allow it these days. So we have to use laboratory stimuli. And the one I'm about to show you is one that's been around for, 80 years now, and is probably the most studied psychological phenomenon in the entire experimental psychology literature. I'm going to present it to you. Those of you who know it, you'll see I'm going to do it in a way that's slightly different to make a particular point. And those of you who don't, play along. So I'm going to ask you in 2 seconds to simply respond out loud when I show you the next slide. I'm not giving you any other instructions. There's no trick. I just want you to do whatever you think it makes sense to do out loud. So you have to use your voice, okay? At the moment at which I go to the next slide, okay? So ready, set, go. Okay, now I heard a red, and I'm betting that's a clever psychologist, right? Or a psychologist who thinks they're being clever, but I guarantee it took that person an extra 250 milliseconds to respond. The red came well after the initial wave of greens. And that phenomenon, that it takes you longer to name the color, in this case, than read the word, as I say, is one of the most robust findings in psychological literature. This is referred to as the Stroop Task, or this is a Stroop stimulus. It was first reported by J.R.R. Stroop at Vanderbilt University as a graduate student. He discovered this. He thought it was an interesting sort of indicator of people's attentional abilities. He spent his graduate career studying it, decided it was so arcane, so irrelevant, and so unimportant for the course of humanity that he gave up psychology and became a minister. And he missed the boat on that one, in my opinion. There's actually a museum in his honor at Vanderbilt. So, as you've noted already, there are 2 dimensions to the stimulus. The word itself, that's spelled out orthographically, and then the wavelength of light in which it's presented. And the reason I did it, normally in the laboratory we have people name the color to see how good they are at sort of exercising control. But I did it the way I did to point out that there's a prepotent response. There's a compelling response, just like scratching an itch, reading a word, at least by the time you're 20. Now, interestingly, if you do this with 5 or 6-year-olds who have just learned to read, you get the opposite effect, right? But by the time you're 20, you spend a lot more time reading words and maybe mentally pronouncing them, if not overtly, than you have doing things like saying, umami, mami, look, red fire truck, right? So you're not naming the colors of things very much by the time you're an adult, but you're certainly doing a lot of reading. So reading becomes a strong response, and yet, with a single instruction, much as the one telling you not to scratch, but in this case telling you to name the color, you could all do it. What color is that? Red, no problem, right? So there's a laboratory example of the exercising of cognitive control. I guess I've already made this point, so I won't belabor that. The mechanisms underlying this capacity are actually starting to yield to science. So we know something about the brain areas and the contribution they're making to at least simple forms of control, like the sort I'm talking about here. I should have paused, sorry, in the previous slide, or maybe what's grayed out in the upper part of this one, to say that it's not only in its own sort of simple way characteristic of humans, but it's fundamental to virtually all other faculties that we consider to be characteristic or perhaps even unique to humans. Language, problem solving, economic decision making, all of these require cognitive control in one form or another. And as I started to say, the mechanisms that underlie this capacity are starting to come to be understood. So we know something about the role of the prefrontal cortex in maintaining goal representation. So when I say to you, name the color, the notion is that you maintain that representation in the front of your brain, that instruction, and then that serves to sort of guide processing in the favor of doing the thing that I instructed you to do, as opposed to doing what you do if that representation wasn't there. It sort of sets the context, okay? We know something about the role of dopamine, both in learning how to do this, and that's a contribution that Reid has been seminal in making, and in evaluating and updating goal representations that's sort of been built on the story of the role of dopamine in learning. So we're sort of gaining an understanding of the mechanisms in the brain that might support this ability. I wouldn't say we have an exhaustive understanding, far from it, but we're starting to understand the basics. But what's really remarkable is that despite these advances, there's still one perplexing mystery that I think dominates all the others, okay? And that is a characteristic that concerns a feature of cognitive control that is, one could argue, its simplest or most easily described, its most basic, its most general. It's true of control, as we'll talk about in a moment, essentially definitionally. It's influential both in science and in the real world, as we'll talk about. It's most striking. It's really a remarkably, well, you'll see, spare effect. And in some ways, it's the most embarrassing one to us as a species. And that's the radical constraint on its engagement. So you can only do one controlled thing at a time. If I ask you to name the color and do a mental arithmetic problem, you won't be able to do both at once. You'll either make a mistake on the mental arithmetic problem, or you'll end up reading the word. Same thing if I ask you to scratch, not to scratch, right? If you start thinking hard about a problem, you'll find yourself, without realizing it, scratching, even though you intended not to. So this has actually become, there are even laws that are based on this observation, right? You're not allowed to talk on a cell phone and drive at the same time, at least in many states, and basically for the same reason. This observation is actually central to the definition of control, both at a theoretical level when it was first described as a construct in the mid-70s, and actually became, in effect, in a literally paradigmatic sense, a Kuhnian sense, a definition of control in the sense that we operationalize control in the laboratory by relying on this property. So the way you diagnose a process as being control dependent, for example, such as color naming, is by having somebody do it at the same time that you have them do something else that you know is control dependent. Now, there's a certain circularity there, which I hope this talk will help sort of break, but anyway, this has been the practice for the last 50 years. You pick something like mental arithmetic, right, or planning, or something that you just know has got to demand control, and then you have somebody do something like that at the same time they do color naming, and if they can't do both at once, then they're controlled, and if you can do one of them, then that one is thought of as not demanding of control, meaning it's sort of automatic, right? So it's literally paradigmatic, this capacity constraint. It's definitional. And it, not surprisingly, is therefore a foundational assumption of most current models of cognitive control, including models at sort of the symbolic level, for those who are familiar with the field, like ACT-R and SOAR, as well as the kinds of models that I tend to work with and that I'll be talking more about today, referred to as PDP, or parallel distributed processing, or connectionist models. Okay? But all of them make the assumption. They say, look, to model human cognition in some domain, we're just going to assume that they can only do one control-dependent thing at a time. So in ACT-R, for example, it's assumed that you have only a certain amount of working memory available to activate a goal representation. So if you activate one, you don't have any room left to activate the other. Okay? It's built into the model. There's no actual account of why there's this capacity constraint. And in fact, if you ask psychologists, why is there capacity constraint, they either look at you and say, you know, that's a good question, right? Or they say really stupid things. I'm embarrassed on behalf of my field to say this, but that some of them say really stupid stuff, right? Like, it's a metabolic problem. There's not enough glucose in the frontal cortex to support more than one control-dependent representation. Now, why is this idiotic? Because we know in the back of your brain, you're doing what we might now call a deep learning problem, which is object recognition, that we know it takes Google servers, exabytes worth of data, and God knows how many gigabytes worth of energy to do. You're doing it in the back of your brain all day long, and in fact, all night long, because you dream in Technicolor, right? So there's not enough glucose to do two mental arithmetic problems in the front of your head, but there's this stuff that's able to do deep learning all day long and all night long. It just doesn't add up, right? The other kind of answer that's given is structural. I think I've gotten a little ahead of myself on the slides here. Right, okay, so I said this. And that's equally idiotic because we know that in the front of your brain, you have about a third of the cells of the neocortex, and the total neocortex is about 100 billion cells, so front is maybe a third, so that's 30 billion cells. So you've got this device that has 30 billion cores, or computational units, and it can't do two arithmetic problems at the same time. My watch can do two arithmetic problems at the same time if I asked it to, okay? So how is it that engineer was such a bad, how is it that evolution was such a bad engineer that it took 30 billion cores to solve a problem that you can solve with basically two, right? It just doesn't add up. It simply doesn't add up. It cannot possibly be that we have structural metabolic problems. We need a more rational explanation in terms of mechanism. Why did the brain come to encode things in such a way that it can only do one control-dependent process at a time? And I'm going to tell you the punchline right now, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the talk hopefully bringing you along with me in believing the conclusion that I'm about to tell you. And it has to do with the nature of representations in network architectures that face a fundamental tension between using the same representation for multiple purposes and using dedicated for representation for multiple purposes. So it's a tension between shared representations that have the virtue of generalization and flexibility and learning efficiency, as opposed to separated representations which support sort of fluidity or multitasking performance, the ability to do many things in parallel at the same time. Now, I know those sound like technical terms for those of you who are not in the field, but I'm going to hopefully give you enough examples and demonstrations that you'll start to get at least an intuitive sense of what I'm talking about here. This, I think, has, as I said earlier, fundamental consequences, not only for understanding how the brain works, but also understanding artificial systems that are being developed. And in fact, machine learning is starting to bark up a tree that they're going to find is a dead end for certain kinds of things they want to do if they don't attend to this problem. And again, I'll come back to that at the end. So the argument is that there's this fundamental trade-off between having shared representations, which again we'll talk about in detail, versus separated representations, and that the brain prefers learning over fluidity overall. So there's a strong bias towards shared representation, at least early during learning, but that if you find out through experience, or you're told, right, or you learn to predict that fluidity or multitasking or parallel processing is important, you can train it up to separate it out. And I would argue that is exactly the process of automation that underlies skill acquisition. So when you first learn to drive a car or stick shift, right, you have to keep your mind on when you're supposed to press the pedal in on the clutch or press it on the brake and release the clutch and move the stick shift, right? And if anybody's in the car talking to you, you're going to shoot them, right? Just shut up, let me do this. especially if you're in a place like here or San Francisco, or if you don't get it right, you're going to find yourself backing into somebody behind you, right? So when you first learn to drive that car, you're using a shared representation that only allows you to do things serially, but clearly that's not a particularly good thing because often somebody is in the car that you want to listen to. So over the course of time, you end up separating out and dedicating representations to doing all these operations that then can be done fluidly so that you can talk at the same time. Okay? So this distinction is one that not only explains certain static properties of the system, but also how things evolve through learning. And again, I'll demonstrate that with you as the guinea pigs in just a few moments. So let me now sort of describe this in the context of the Stroop task and what a network architecture looks like, because I'm going to want to appeal to that later when I provide an account of some of the things that some of the phenomena we're going to talk about that I think this explains. So here's the basic idea. You've got, and this is a model of the Stroop task that we developed a long time ago. Oops, wrong one. Yeah, but it's not working, but I have one. Here we go, I'm good. I'm fine. Here you go. So there's two pathways here, okay? These are inputs that are coding the color of a stimulus. So this might be, for the neuroscientists in the room, V1 or maybe V4 if it's color sensitive. And then this is some other area of the brain that's learned to recognize squiggles as being meaningful, right? So some area that encodes orthography into words, maybe visual word form areas, sort of more anterior part of visual cortex. And then these things encode the stimulus, and then they communicate them by way of associative units to some part of the brain that's responsible for pulling the strings on your vocal cords in your lungs to say something like red or green. And the problem with the Stroop task is that you can't do both at once, right? You can't read the color or name the color and read the word because you only have one phonologic code. So if you tried to do that, you'd end up saying something like gred or reen, and people would laugh at you, and you don't want people laughing at you. So you got to choose, right? And it's that choice that we think of as the role for control. The purpose of control is exactly to come into play in those situations when, for whatever other reasons, you only have one representation, but it now needs to be put to two purposes. You can think of this as a shared representation. I have a shared phonologic code for emitting sounds that have to do with frequencies of light and for emitting sounds that have to do with squiggles on a page that happen to constitute words, right? Now, this gets by because most of the time I don't have to do the Stroop task. In fact, I can spend most of my life, as long as I don't walk into a psychology laboratory, never having to do this, right? So that's a perfectly satisfactory situation. But in the situation where I do, I fortunately have something that ensures that I only do one or the other of these. And I'll show you models that do that in just a moment, right? So the purpose of control is this. It's to have a representation, and I would contend that this is what the frontal cortex is doing to first approximation. It's representing the instruction I gave you that favors this pathway in the case where you want to name the color and allows it to sort of supersede or overcome what would otherwise have been the stronger response, the word reading response. That's the purpose of control, right? And again, to sort of give you the punchline, calling control well, okay, we'll get there. All right, now, there's one way you could have solved this problem, right? You could have had this situation where you had two different representations, phonologic representations, one for naming colors and one for reading words. But that's a problem because you only have one mouth. So we sort of kick the can down the road and down a road that we're not going to find a solution. We're not going to have two mouths because if I had two mouths, you'd have to have 4 ears to listen to them, right? And we wouldn't get very far, right? Or maybe there are species. Maybe this is how dolphins and whales talk. I don't know. But for us, this turned out to be not such a useful solution. It was more effective to do this, again, because we don't see a lot of stimuli like this, right? And so in the case that you have this, you need control. Here you don't need control, right? Here, if you see red and green, this one says green, this one says red, and all is fine as long as the listener can make sense out of what you're doing. Okay? So let me now make this a little bit more concrete by giving you an illustration that was actually that was done in the mid-'70s. So most of the field followed Posner and Snyder and Schifrin and Schneider, the people that said, listen, control is defined by limited capacity processing. We're going to diagnose it by showing that you can only do one thing at a time. And they were sort of bit by the CPU bug of the late 60s and early 70s when it had been proven that network architectures were not good computational platforms by a very famous book written by Minsky and Papert, showing that they weren't computationally general, or at least in the form that they had been proposed at that point. And we should build architectures around the von Neumann architecture, where there's a single CPU that does all the processing, and it can do it really fast, so it can sort of pretend to be parallel by first doing a little this, then a little that. So I'm going to say red and green, okay, and it'll sound like I said red and green at the same time, but really I did one after the other. Right? That's sort of the philosophy, the architecture, the strategy for serial computing that dominated computing for like the first 50 years of computer science. That has begun to change radically, as we'll talk about, over the last 5 or 10 years. It changed about 30 years ago in psychology when we realized that was not a good model of what people were doing. In any event, even when early on psychologists were claiming that this sort of single CPU-like control mechanism that had a limited capacity was a good model for explaining why people could only do one control-dependent thing at a time, there were other psychologists that were saying, that may not be right. Maybe the capacity constraint lies somewhere else. It doesn't lie in the controller, it lies in the things that control is presiding over, and in fact, as I've already started to suggest, the role of control is to deal with that problem. So here's the experiment that was done, and it's just so elegant, I can't not sort of describe it to you. So they had people do 2 tasks, because this is what we're interested in, whether you can do 2 things at once. If you can't, then one is controlled. If you can, then one or both maybe are automatic. So they started by having people do echoing of an auditory stream. So you listen to some words that are being spoken on some headphones, and you just say those words out loud. Okay? So dog, I say dog. I hear cat, I say cat. And then at the same time, you look at a page with words written on it, and you have to type those. So cat is written on them, I got to type out cat. Dog's written, I got to type out dog. Okay? But I have to do both at the same time. And it turns out that people can learn to do that pretty quickly. Like some out of the box, some 5 or 10 minutes, 20 minutes. You can do it within a laboratory session. Okay? Get people to echo and copy type. But if you keep the same inputs and outputs, but you just flip what the mappings are, okay? So you have them, instead of doing echoing and copy typing, doing dictation, which means listening to the auditory input, but now typing what's being said in your ears. And at the same time, again, reading what's on the page, but now instead of typing that, saying that out loud, no can do. Takes about 10 years of experience to be able to do that, okay? I mean, you can imagine it. And we'll do one like it in just a few minutes. You'll see. And so what's really striking about this is that word reading, remember, word reading is the thing that is the prepotent response in the Stroop Task. That's the canonical automatic task in an adult, in a literate adult, right? And yet, you can't word read at the same time that you can sort of take dictation, right? This is not doable. And this presentation of it is theoretically biased. It's shown to make a point. The reason and the inference that the people who did these experiments drew from this is that in this case, each representation, the phonological or pool of representations, the phonologic representations and the orthographic representations are being put to separate uses. They're not being asked to sort of do dual function, right? But in this case, you have a double whammy. Both of them are asked to do 2 different things at the same time. So if the word you heard was cat, but the word on the page was dog, you encode cat phonologically, but you now got to translate it into an orthographic representation in order to be able to type it out, right? And if you heard the word dog, or sorry, you saw the word dog, you saw it and encoded it orthographically as being dog, but now you have to translate it into a phonologic code in order to be able to speak it. But if this thing is seeing cat here and it's getting dog from over here, it can't represent cat and dog at the same time any more than you can say red and green at the same time, right? You'd end up saying like cog and that or something. So that's not good. And then by symmetry, the same thing happens here. So the problem isn't that this is reflecting a capacity constraint on cognitive control. It's that the system has been wired in such a way as that it can't function doing the 2 different tasks that it's been asked to do at the same time. And so control steps in and says, don't do that, that's stupid, pick one and do it. Or switch between doing them, but just don't do them both at the same time. So, you know, it's sort of like saying that cognitive control and a capacity constraint on cognitive control, the limited RAM it has, or the small number of slots, or the metabolic constraint that it has, is the reason you can only do one thing at a time. It's like blaming the firemen for the fire. Right? It's like saying, every time I see a fire, there are firemen there. They must be causing the fire. right? It's the opposite. They're there to solve the fire, right? The reason you see firemen when there's a fire is that they're part of the solution. The reason you see cognitive control engaged when you're having a hard time doing two things at once is not because cognitive control is the problem, it's there to solve the problem. The problem was caused by something else. Whatever wired these things up in the first place and didn't generate separate phonologic codes for auditory input and visual input. Okay? So that's, if you come away from this talk with nothing else, that's the point. You don't have a limited capacity for cognitive control. And I'm going to just keep hammering that point in one way after another. So here's the next way, by analogy. Imagine that you're sort of an urban planner, right? And you've been asked to design a new town in the middle of the desert somewhere. And the first thing you need to do is build up the town. And so you got to build a brickyard that's going to generate bricks for building buildings. And maybe you want it to be an educated town, so you got to build a book foundry or a printing shop to print books that can go to the school and the library. So you put the brickyard here, and then how are you going to get the bricks to the place where you're doing the construction? Well, maybe build a train track where you put some roads, right, so that some vehicle can take the stuff and deliver it. And you do the same thing between the printing press and the library or the school. And that works fine for a while, but the town is successful. People start moving there. They want other construction sites built or other buildings built. And so now you got to get the bricks to that other site. And it turns out that the next site is on the other side of the library, right? Well, what do? You could build another brickyard, but there's not such a good mining opportunity over there, and you've already got all the staff over here. So what do? You build a new train track. You just run some trains from the brickyard to the new site. But there's a problem. It's on the other side of the tracks that take the books from the printing press to the school or the library, right? And so now you got a problem. What are you going to do about the point at which they cross? And there's two things you can do. You could build an overpass or an underpass, right? And the trains would continue to go without having to worry about scheduling. But that's expensive. It takes time. Where I live in New Jersey, I live near Route 1, a major thoroughfare. And a few years after I got there, and there's lights along the whole thing, right? And so a few years after I got there, they decided that this was really not acceptable, and they were going to deal with the traffic problem by building some overpasses over Route 1. And 3 years, and God knows how many millions, if not billions of dollars later, the town council swore they would never build another one of these. Why? Because not only was it expensive, but it was disruptive while it was happening, right? It was really, really a problem. And so what's the other possibility? Well, there's a really simple one. Just put up some lights. Let there be crossings, and then just put up some lights that'll regulate traffic. Okay? So this is like the phonologic and orthographic codes that I showed you. It's cheap to allow them to allow different processes to use the same spots, in this case, the same physical locations, and all we have to do is put a few lights up to manage the traffic. That's the control system. So now think about asking, why is control limited? Is it because green lights are more expensive than red lights? That's idiotic. Lights aren't even that expensive. What it is that if you had a lot of these crossings now, and you turned all the lights on green, right, there'd be no point in having the lights. There'd be crashes all over the place, right? So you can frame the problem as, given a certain number of crossings, how many green lights can I have at any given time? And you can make this a little bit more realistic by saying, well, I don't know exactly when, if I knew exactly when the trains were coming, then maybe I could sort of get a fair number of them green. But let's just assume for the moment that you don't always know when it's coming. You don't know what I'm going to show you as Stroop stimulus. So you're going to have a prior, sort of an expectation on how many lights you should, on average, have that are green. And I will tell you about work in a moment that is rather striking in its conclusions, which says that under reasonable circumstances, doesn't matter how big the system is, if it has a certain modest proportion of crossings, there's a numerical upper limit. It's not a percentage. There's a numerical upper limit on how many lights should be green. And that's the argument as to why the capacity for cognitive control is limited. It's because statistically, on average, if you have a lot of crossings, then there's likely to be train accidents if you don't make most of the lights red and only turn the ones that aren't green that at the moment you know need to be. Okay? So, I guess I've anticipated this question, which how does the maximum number of processes in the case of the human cognitive architecture that support multitasking scale as a function of the potential crosstalk or shared representations in networks? And the answer, as I've already suggested, is that it scales really badly. Modest amounts of overlap or sharing of representation dramatically limit the multitasking capability, and that this constrains And constraints on multitasking reflect this trade-off. So this is not the place to go through the formal sort of mathematical analysis of this problem or the computational simulations that we've done, but I do want to just quickly put up a picture that graphically illustrates what I just said. So this is went too fast. This is a plot of a bunch of different networks, in this case that we simulated, and now we have mathematical tools that sort of verify in formal analysis that these results apply generally, that asks, given a certain number of pathways, color naming, word reading, word pointing, all the different kinds of things you can imagine given a certain set of inputs and a certain set of outputs that you could ask somebody to do, how many is it optimal to turn on at the same time on average? And so as a function of how many crossings there are. So we built networks that had crossings. We also built networks that had overpasses and underpasses, right? And the idea is, as a function of how many crossings as opposed to overpasses and underpasses that we build, how good is the network at doing, how many things can it do at once if we sort of test it under optimal conditions? And you can see that it's just remarkable. With only about 20% of overlap, so 20% crossings, it doesn't matter how big your network is, you can never do in these particular simulations more than 14 or 15 things. Now, 14 or 15 sounds a lot. I'll address that in just a moment. But even that number is remarkable when you think that a network of size, 20 can do, some number of things, but 40 and you're constrained at 15, and with 1,000 you're constrained at 15. This does not grow proportionally. This is a fixed asymptotic limit on the number of things that any system can do that supports this amount of pathway overlap. And sort of as a sanity check, just to know whether this number had any meaning, not that I put a lot of stock in this, though I think over the years to come we'll be able to assess this more reliably, but we went and looked at the Human Connectome database, Human Connectome Project database. This is an effort run by Olaf Sporns at Indiana University, trying to collect as many MRI images as he can get his hands on. And he has hundreds of thousands now. And then doing statistical analyses and graph analyses to ask how many nodes are there in the brain when we average over all these different conditions in which people have been tested and measured, and what do the pathways look like. And because they've sort of documented all this, we can ask how many crossings are there. And when you look at that, it's remarkable. There's about 15 to 20% of pathways crossed. So this number is not a crazy number. And if that number holds, then these numbers we can now say with a certain amount of certainty hold. And this explains why you don't want a lot. Now, 15 or whatever that number is, I think it's actually 13, is still more than 1. But you can get to 1 pretty quickly by taking away some of the simplifying assumptions that we had to put in these models in order to run them on the computers that we had. So these models assumed linearity, they assumed sort of binary choices as opposed to multi-choices, they assumed rather general rather than very specific control representations, distributed. I don't want to bore you with all the technicalities here, but I put it up to show that if you took account of all these more realistic assumptions, which are much harder to test in simulations, although these days we're getting closer to being able to do it, all of these things, if you made them more realistic assumptions, would act in the direction of making fewer of these things possible. Okay? So I'm confident that in not too long, we'll have versions of this that basically say, on average, you really can't afford to do more than one control demanding thing in a system that has lots, or sorry, not lots, but like 20% overlap. Okay? So that sort of puts an upper bound and says, listen, shared representations cost you in multitasking. But now it puts the onus on us to understand, well, why would we want shared representations? This seems like a bad idea. Now, in the case of the Stroop example that I described to you earlier, right, 2 mouths is not a possibility, so you're forced. But this constraint doesn't just apply to things that are output constrained. You can't do 2 mental arithmetic problems at the same time. Even if I say, don't bother telling me the answer till later, you'll still be forced to sort of sequentialize those operations. So it's true of internal states and exhibits sort of internal constraints, even when the output doesn't itself constrain the problem. So there's something more fundamental than just the output constraints. So what's driving it? And as I started out by saying, we think that it has to do with learning, that learning benefits by shared representations. And when we first started this work, this was just sort of an intuition and sort of folk wisdom that those of us who have been working with neural network modeling techniques for well, now really several decades, sort of had gained the sense of. But now that neural network models have become an industrial priority, literally they are what make Tesla cars drive themselves, right? This is the rage in machine learning over the past decade. The entire focus of that community is how can we design these systems to do more shared learning because it's really efficient. So if you go to NIPS, the main society, with like 50,000 attendees every year, all pretty much now machine learning theorists, right? The main focus they have right now is how can we get our networks to share representations. Why? Because when you learn a representation in one domain and it's applicable in others, you can generalize. Okay? It's a powerful way of getting a network that sees a cat in one picture that's gray and spotted to learn that that same label should be applied to another cat that's black and has no tail, right? It's because the representations are shared. So once it realizes that it's the same representation for a cat, it can assign the same label, and it can do things that we as humans are very good at doing, which is to generalize. But, as I hope I've convinced you, this costs us in the ability to multitask. That is, to do more than one control-demanding thing at a time. So just to drive home this point about learning, and that this is true for you sitting in this room today, let's do another demonstration. This time we're going to do 3 tasks. They're all going to involve variants on the Stroop task that I started with, but they're going to be different than the way that we did it at the beginning. So the first task is going to be to actually do 2 tasks, a multitask. So this is to sort of show you that you can actually, under proper circumstances, in fact, many do more than one thing at a time, even when they've been thought of as control demanding. So I'm going to ask you to do the Stroop task, to name the color. So I'm going to put a Stroop stimulus up here, like red and green ink or blue and yellow or something. And I'm going to ask you to name the color. So do the Stroop task, right? This time, don't just read out loud. Don't read it. Name the color. But at the same time that you're naming the color, I want you to point. The stimulus is going to appear over here, and I just want you to point at it at the same time that you say what the color is. Okay? Now, just out of curiosity, do you think that this is going to be super hard, super easy, relatively easy? So how many people think it's going to be super hard? How many people think it's going to be relatively easy? Right. Most people think this is going to be easy, and it will be. I'm not looking to trick you here. I want you to remember this, though, because there's an interesting puzzle that this story presents of its own that I think is an interesting, maybe the most important direction for research. So just keep that in mind. OK, you ready? Ready, set, go. Very good. Somebody said green. That worries me. All right, ready? Now you said green. Good. So that wasn't hard, right? You did 2 things at once. You pointed. It seems trivial, but you did 2 things at once, including something that's control demanding, supposedly, right? So you have no problem multitasking, quote unquote, control demanding things if I give you the right other thing to do. So right there's sort of a problem, a kink in the armor of we only have a limited number of neurons or a limited amount of metabolism to do control problems. It probably took you more ATP to lift more glucose to lift your arm and point than it did to say the word out loud. Okay, next task, we're going to do something different, and it's only 1 task. It's only going to be the word red or green, okay? And if you see the word red, I don't want you to name it or read it, I want you to read it, but I don't want you to say it out loud. Don't say anything out loud. No speaking out loud, okay? People always miss this instruction, so just get that straight. No speaking out loud. I just want you to point left if it's the word red, and green if it's the word, and right if it's the word green, right? The color doesn't matter. There'll be a color there, but just ignore that. Just read the word, but then instead of saying it, just point left if it's red and point right if it's green. So everybody got that? Which way do you point if it's left, if it's green? Very good. And red? All right. Excellent. Ready, set, go. Perfect. Perfect. Oh, I should have asked you. Well, okay, be honest. Did you think that was going to be hard or easy? Easy. Exactly. Okay? So you just did something that you've never done before on pretty much the first try, right? And keep that in mind. All right, the last one. You're going to do exactly what you did just now. If it's red, I want you to point left, and if it's green, I want you to point right. Okay? But this time, I want you to name the color. So you read the word and point in the direction. Don't say the word, but you have to name the color. Okay? The chuckles already give away the answer, but is this going to be easy or hard? hard. Everybody knows this, right? This is remarkable that you know this and you've never done it, right? But people are pointing in all directions. Nobody said anything, right? This is impossible. Here's the data. It's the only experiment I've ever done that doesn't need statistics, and I don't show it to my undergraduates because that might convince them that they don't need to do statistics. And it's an uphill battle to teach them to do statistics, so we don't do this. But here's the data. Now, so this is from the first task that you did, the color naming, or first dual task, color naming and location pointing. The second one, just simply pointing in the direction that the word says, and then the last one. And the reason that these numbers are lower than the ones that would have been true for this room is that in the laboratory, we can make sure that when you do these two things together, that you do them within amount of time that ensures that they were actually done together rather than first doing one and then quickly trying to do the other, because we're not interested in that. We're interested in whether you can do them both at once, right? And so people get pretty good. They're never at 100%. But some of them are 70, 80% accuracy. They're actually even better at learning to do this test that they've never done before. By the way, I should have said this is, I think it's maybe 30 or 40 undergraduates doing several hundred trials of each of these. So these are data averaged over several hundred trials. And that's relevant for this third one because even after several hundred trials, they can't do better than 5%. They simply cannot do this task. And in fact, 1,000 trials later, only some of them can do it. And it takes about 10,000 trials, and we know this because we're studying this in the lab now and doing some brain imaging, which I wouldn't say much about, but maybe I'll sneak in here in a moment, to look at what happens as they learn this. But the bottom line is that without 1,000 trials or more, you can't do this. So why? And I think the answer is sort of intuitively obvious, but let's go through it. Here's the color naming task. So here's, here's the model that I showed you earlier for the Stroop task, where colors map to word, and then you're not using this pathway in this task, but it's there. And then the first task you did was to do this at the same time that you did pointing. So I have to add some units here that encode the actual spatial position of the stimulus and some associative units that are used to then generate a manual pointing response in response to the location. Okay? So why can you do those two things at once? Because sort of like in the echoing and copy typing, the color naming task involves intermediate representations that are not the same ones that you need when you're pointing, right? So you can do both at once. There's no crosstalk. There's no interference. There's no crossing here, right? I now teach you a new task to point in the direction that a word says, and you didn't have that pathway, but you learned it pretty quickly. And the idea is that you took your knowledge about how to read words, and you simply created a new pathway on the fly. And this is maybe a little bit misleading because I think it probably goes indirectly through the hippocampus. It's sort of one-trial learning, so it can't really be neocortical. But however you do it, you use this representation that you have for encoding words to generate a pointing response, only when you're, and that you can do quickly, but when you're asked to do that at the same time as this, now you have a problem. Because if you turn this and this on to do color naming, and you turn this and this on to do word pointing, you've opened up this. And that's been there since you were 5. So now you're screwed, right? Because when you try and read the word, even though you're trying to point, you can't help but sort of activate the representation, which is interfering with your ability to name the color. When you do the Stroop task successfully by naming the color, you suppress this. As I showed you at the beginning, that's the purpose of control, to suppress this. But you can't suppress it here because you need it for this, if this is how you've done it. Right? Now, there is an alternative. You could have done it like this. You could have created some new representation for words that are used just for pointing, or even use some old representation for pointing, but that's never really been associated with words. But you'd have to teach this how to recognize words, right? And that's a lot harder. And so you do this. And the fact that you couldn't do this task is manifest evidence for the fact that there's a bias in learning for shared representations. This is exactly what I mean when I say that there's a bias for shared representations. You're learning to share this representation that was built for word reading for this new task. Okay? But when you do that, you can't multitask. So that's sort of the story in a nutshell. I hesitate to show this, but I think for the sort of the more scientifically educated or inclined in the room, I'll do it because it's so beautiful. I can't resist not doing it. It's work of a graduate student, Sebastian Muslik, who's been sort of one of the leaders on this project. And so I apologize to those who are not sort of technically oriented. But this is an attempt to show that if you train up a network on a set of tasks now. Now it's not just 2 or 3. Well, it's 3 inputs possibilities. So you can think about this as colors and shapes and maybe and sounds. And these are 3 possible responses. So using your hand, using your mouth, or using your foot, or whatever. And the idea is that in this space, there's 2 ways you can represent the information. In this way, which we call a minimal basis set, which is sort of the most compact code, where you encode each stimulus dimension and then map it from that encoded representation to the 3 possible outputs. And that gives you the 9 tasks that you can, in principle, do here, right? This, 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 this. If you train up a network on single tasks, it has a strong bias to develop this kind of compact representation, which shares the representations for all the 3 tasks that can be done with the single stimulus input, right, across those possible, across the different tasks, right? And so this shows evidence that that's the way a network actually learns when you just train it up on backpropagation, which, again, if you're familiar with deep learning, is at the heart of deep learning. And what this shows, so this shows sort of how well the network is doing. So this is error, so as it's going down, it's getting better. And what this shows is an analysis of the activity patterns over this layer of the network. This is a cartoon, right, that sort of shows one way of solving the problem. But what we want to know is, do networks actually solve it that way? So we run the network many, many times, and we measure its activity at this layer at different points along the training. And with correlational methods, we can ask how similar are the different representations for the different inputs and the different tasks, and using sort of fancy mathematical tools, well, not so fancy, actually, just principal components analysis, we can say, how many different kinds of representations does the network have, right, that it's learned when it's able to do the task? And so if we train it up on single tasks, you can see what happens is as it starts learning, this layer here starts to separate out into 3 kinds of representations, right? And that's when it solved the task. And the argument is that that's these 3 representations here, each of which, depending upon this, remember it's only learning single tasks, is needed to do 3 different tasks. Okay? So we call this a minimal basis set because it's the most efficient code possible for this particular space. And now we can compare it with the situation in which the network is forced to multitask. So it's given pairs or triplets of tasks that it has to learn. And the only way it can really learn to do that is to separate out the representations of each input and dedicate one sort of associative pattern of activity with each of the possible tasks that that input might be paired with, right? So this is the solution of separating out the representations, like having 2 phonologic codes, one for color naming and one for orthographic codes, right? So the question is, what happens if we train the network on multitasking? Does it develop? And here you can see there are 9 internal representations. And so if you do the right analysis, you should see 9 dots here. And what you find is that when you train it up, initially, it learns that there are 3. So it sort of does the first solution first. So here it's separated into 3. And only later, when it actually learns to solve the task, does it divide it up, and it divides it up into 9. So when it's forced to multitask, it learns what we've come to call the tensor product representation, sort of the full possible pairing of all inputs and outputs needed to keep them separate so you can do as many things as you want. But it only does it under the pressure to do multitasking. So by analogy, you can imagine that somebody learning to play a piano or going to a piano to play the piano wants to impress their 6-year-old, and it's not going to take much. All they have to do is see the letters on the page and know something about how letters map to shapes of keys, and then use what they've had for a long time, which is an algorithm, an internal capability to decide where they want to put a finger, right? So they see A, and they know A maps to this key, so they just go, OK, I'll put my finger there. Now, if a chord is written, it's going to be very hard because they have to use the same algorithm to decide where to put this finger based on an A and this finger based on a C. And that, as an unexperienced pianist, I don't have. I have a shared representation for how to put fingers in places that I can do sequentially. So I could learn to play the chord by first putting this key here, finger here, and this, and anybody who's played guitar or piano knows that that's at least how most people start to learn, right? And you get by, if you're just entertaining a 6-year-old by playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, you can do it with one finger using this simple shared representation. And it doesn't matter which finger. I could use this finger, I can use this finger. It's all the same because it's one representation. I don't have to relearn it. Of course, that's not going to get me very far if I want to be a concert pianist. Now I've got to put the time and effort under the pressure of needing to put several fingers down at the same time under different instructions to develop separate representations for each of my fingers. right? And that's what learning to play a chord is, I think, in these terms. And so in the lab, we're starting to do studies where we train people, in fact, to do exactly the task you did, this word pointing while color naming. And the prediction is that when they're first doing it, and they can't do it any more than you can, they're using the same representation for encoding the word, right, to point as they would for reading, and that's what causes the interference. That predicts that the brain imaging data should be the same when they're simply word reading and when they're doing this new task. You should see the same pattern of neural activity, right? After 10,000 trials, when they've learned to do both at once, our prediction is that they should have separated. And in fact, we're scanning them along the way and looking to make movies like the one I just showed you here, which is that the representations separate over the course of enforced multitasking training. Okay? Now, that kind of experiment is being done just to sort of give validity or some support to the theory. But it actually has sort of almost spine-chillingly powerful consequences if it works out. So imagine the following situation. Sorry, I guess I won't go through the analysis of the data, but I'll just say that we can extend the analyses that I just talked about and that I showed in the last plot of neural networks to patterns of brain activity, right? And infer from patterns of brain activity how similar representations are, just as I did to generate these plots. And that turns out, if it works, to be an incredibly powerful thing. Why? Because we can take a space of possible tasks, which, let's say we measured the brain activity under each individual possible task. So in the case of the model that I just showed you, it's 9 tasks, but I'll talk about a more realistic example in just a moment, where it's many more than that. But the problem scales linearly with the number of tasks. I only have to take a certain number of, I only have to take one brain imaging sort of set of brain images per task. And then with mathematics that I haven't talked about, I can infer from the similarity structure of the representations of the brain activity associated with each task exactly what the multitasking profile of that system is. Now, the multitasking profile pertains to a problem that doesn't scale linearly, but rather factorially. Namely, it's an NP-hard problem for people who know about things like this. And to give you an example, a space of 10 possible inputs and 10 possible outputs, which would make for 100 possible tasks, right? 100 possible mappings. Any one input could go to any of the 10 outputs, so that's 100 possibilities that we'll call tasks. The number of, so it's 100 tasks. If I wanted to sort of diagnose somebody's brain on this, I'd have to image them only 100 times. But if I had to do it for each pairing of tasks, 47 million. Okay? And that's 10 by 10. But here's, so the problem of multitasking, so you couldn't test them even behaviorally on that number. So there's no way, to go directly at the problem of asking what's a person's multitasking profile. But if we can measure their brain activity, and we can infer the relationships to the extent to which they share or separate representations of the different tasks, we can infer their multitasking capability. And this has possibly immediate consequences. So, for example, in an airplane, I originally used to talk about this and talk about an airplane as having like 10 possible instruments and 10 widgets that the pilot had to work with. And then after I did this for a while, I realized I was maybe being a little bit glib because I never really asked how many widgets or instruments were in an airplane. And I happened to be flying somewhere, and I got stuck, as you often do, sort of at the bottleneck as you're getting on the plane, but people are still putting their bags up, and so you're standing there by the cockpit, and oh yes, thank you for welcoming me aboard, and and I was trying to figure out some way of avoiding that awkward interaction with the steward, and I noticed the pilot standing there, and the cockpit door was open, and so I looked in and I said, hey, how many instruments are on that panel? And he said, I don't know, about 100. I said, okay, and how many controls are there? And he said 30. And then, of course, he looked at me and said, why do you want to know? And my answer was, I'm a neuroscientist, a cognitive psychologist, and I study multitasking. And his eyes lit up. He said, multitasking are us. Right? So why? Because they've got some panel like that they've got to take in, and then a bunch of widgets that they've got to mess with, right? Many of which they have to do at the same time. Not all of which. So, you don't have to know whether or not to turn the bathroom light on when you go into a bank, but you do have to know to pull the ailerons a certain way and set the flaps and change the throttle, right? So there's a lot of things, and you have to be looking at the altimeter and the inclinum or whatever it's called. I don't know. There's an overwhelming number of possible combinations. No theory. Now, the industry has figured out over whatever it's been, 100 years, what reasonable possibilities there are, but now they can make all of these things virtual and nothing has changed, even though they could totally control what the pilot is seeing, because they don't really know. They know what's important, but they don't know what people are capable of. And it's understandable because if 10 by 10 is 47 million, I have no idea what the number is, right? I couldn't even get my calculator to tell me, right? I typed in the permutational space of 150 inputs and 30 outputs, and before I could even do the divide by 2, because there's symmetry and you have to divide by 2, the calculator said, not a number. That's a quote, not a number, right? So there's no way you could ever diagnose the multitasking profile of a pilot, which combinations of things you should expect them to be able to do without 20 years of training, or 10 years, whatever it takes, 10 years, I should say, 5 or 10 years of training to get them to do the things that are most important, right? There's no way you could test them all, or even close. But if we could put them in the scanner and, maybe not 1,500, which is what this would take, or 4,500, because not all of them are relevant, right? But take all the space of individual tasks that might be important, and maybe it's 100 or 200, and in principle, I could put them in the scanner, scan them in each one of those individual tasks, take their pattern of brain activity, crunch it through our analysis methods, and have their entire multitasking profile. Now, we're not there yet, but it seems conceivable that we could get there. And that would change things dramatically, because pilots aren't the only ones, obviously, that face these problems, right? Traders on stock floors. I mean, in every domain, switch operators for systems of train tracks, which are still done to some extent manually. This could really change how we think of skill acquisition in complex domains. So I just put this up there as sort of a practical example. All right, so let me just summarize. I'm guessing I'm probably pretty close to out of time, if not already. Modest amounts of crosstalk produce radical constraints, which explains the capacity constraint. It's not that the controller is limited, it's that it's dealing with a situation that it has to limit to keep us safe, right? And that forces you to go serial, and that's, again, why I think we have constraints on multitasking capability in certain domains. And the control architecture is adapted to this because it reflects an optimization of the trade-off between shared representations and processing efficiency. And among the things that I like about this story is that it highlights the value of the computational analysis at the systems level. It's not neuroscience the way we often think about it at the biophysics level, but it's clearly neuroscience in that it's inspired about what we know about the brain, how the brain represents information, things we can measure about the brain's representation of information, but at a systems level that starts to tell us general principles, properties, boundary conditions that the brain has to live within. Okay? It's a single fundamental principle that I think applies not just to this problem of skill acquisition and multitasking, but in a number of other domains. It explains things in that domain in terms of, say, this issue of learning efficiency versus processing efficiency, and as I mentioned several times, the trajectory from control to automatic processing. But I also think it explains other things that are driven by the same trade-off between shared and separated representations. The binding problem, people blamed the binding problem on attention. That is, well, I won't go through those who don't know it, but for those who know something about this, it's been sort of, again, implied that or inferred that it's a reflection of control, but it's the other way around. Control is there to deal with the fact that there's a bias towards shared representations which produce the binding problem in the first place. And the trade-off between sort of one-shot episodic memory, remembering where you parked your car today, and semantic or statistical memory, knowing where people generally park their cars most frequently, is explained in exactly the same terms, in terms of separated versus shared representations. They all reflect this fundamental, I think, computationally general constraint on intelligent computing that, as I started out saying, and I'll end by saying, may end up being maybe at least in one important sort of application, a guiding principle for the design of artificial systems. You all knew when you were going to get in trouble and when you weren't. Computers don't know that yet, but they're getting in trouble because of this. And if we can design agents, computers, that know how to learn and know how to deploy the different kinds of learning required to develop shared versus separated representations, I think we'll be a step much closer towards building truly autonomous agents that not only learn, but know how to learn to learn. So with that, I will end with all the many people, and not even all of them are on this list, that contributed to this work. This has been like now almost 5 years worth of intensive study involving engineers, mathematicians, psychologists, neuroscientists, and friends all. So thank you for your attention.
you very much for a really exhilarating talk. We have time for a couple questions or comments. Yep, stand up, please, so everybody can hear you when you ask your question.
All right, so when you were having us do the task where we had to say what color word is and point to the wall that, left or right, you noted that that's 2 tasks. But when I was doing it in my head, so let's say if the word written is yellow, but it's in the color green, I had to actively think, okay, don't say yellow, say green, which that would be the cognitive control as you would probably define it. But why wouldn't we think of that as being a 3rd task? Because that's kind of important if we're trying to determine what the upper limit of tasks the brain is able to accomplish.
I think that's a fair question. And obviously in a talk like this, one has to gloss over many of the details and subtleties that are in some ways the most interesting ones for sort of the frontier of research. So the one that I glossed over in this case was that it's not as if sort of when you learn, you first do it one way and then you do it another, or you even gradually move from only one way to another. There's many more complicated phases in the trajectory of learning. And one of the ones that I glossed over is that when you first do the task, I hinted at this when I said that probably you were using your hippocampus to learn that new mapping. Well, the same thing is probably true as you familiarize yourself with the Stroop Task. You're not that used to sort of naming colors when there's a word that's trying to make you do something else, and so you probably use sort of hippocampal assist, reminding yourself of the instruction like you just said, and then you experience that as sort of some conscious strategy for doing the task. But what I can say is that if I had you do this for 200 trials, you wouldn't be doing that anymore. That's an important phase. It's a critical phase for the very initial stages of performance. It's part of what contributes to making you so flexible. It's not just the prefrontal cortex alone. It's sort of a collaboration it has with the hippocampus in representing arbitrary instructions, silly things like don't scratch that you've never heard or thought of to do before. But very quickly, you get past that phase. Okay? And once you're past that phase, you're in a domain where you're not doing it, or at least all the evidence that we have is that you're not doing it the way you just said, and yet you still demonstrate all of these effects of control dependency. Okay? So I think you made an astute introspective observation. I think it applies early, at the very earliest, like the first 10 or 15 trials of training, but not much after that. The reason that we haven't focused on those early phases, that earliest phase so much, which I think, as I said, is a really interesting one, is that it's hard to do experiments. You only get 5 or 10 trials. And often for statistics, you need 100 trials or 200 trials. So we've actually toyed with the idea of trying to do experiments where we only take 5 or 10 trials, but we take 1,000 subjects. And that's the kind of thing that, like Reed is the master of doing. And I just haven't found a graduate student with the stomach to do that yet. But I think I do think it's a really interesting question.
Right there. Yep. Those of us who are blessed with OCD or symptoms of it know rationally that we should be able to control the impulse. What process keeps us from using that control?
That's a great question, and I hesitate to answer it in the context of a place where people like Warren Bickel and Reed Montague do work, because this is at the heart of what they're trying to understand, and if they haven't figured it out, God knows I wouldn't pretend to have. But that said, I will say that what I didn't talk about today, and that actually motivated this line of work in the first place, is that sitting on top of this control apparatus, and the one hint of it that I got to in this talk, though I didn't make much of it, was that you guys all knew at a meta level what was going to be hard or easy. That suggests that there's some sort of supervening mechanism that has some kind of notion, some kind of model, we might say, of what the capabilities are and aren't. It's not perfect because it's not smart enough to tell us not to drive and talk on our cell phones at the same time. We're all duped into thinking that that's a good idea, right? And in some sense, I would say that that's an evidence of the boundaries of even normal function that are pathological. And so if whatever fails to recognize that is accentuated in some individuals, you might start getting conditions that make it even harder for people under what we would call normal or ordinary circumstances, right, than others are. We have a theory that, or I will call it a proto-theory, sort of a theoretical framework for thinking about this question. We call it the expected value of control theory. And what that says in very broad terms is that when you make decisions about what you're going to do, what task you're going to do, come to this lecture, go out to dinner, work on a paper, watch TV, You're doing something that's very similar to what you do, the way people have described simpler decisions like economic choices, which is you do a cost-benefit analysis and you pick the thing that is most likely to give you the highest level of reward or reward rate, okay? So you compute in literally the expected value of investing control in this, coming to this talk, as opposed to doing something like watching TV. And what goes into that computation is some estimate of what you're going to get out of it, but also what the cost that you're going to invest in it is. And people have not talked much about that. And that's why I'm taking the pains to give you a long answer to a simple question. When you invest control, there's some kind of cost. We all experience it. If I tell you multiply 37 by 26 in your head, you know you can do it, but you're going to go, do I really have to, right? And there's some effort. And again, this is among the things that led people to think it was glucose, but it's not. There's some computation that you're doing about how much interference that's going to produce with other things like listening to me or attending to other signals in the environment that are relevant that you're doing, right? So you're estimating the cost as well as what you'll get out of it, impressing everybody with your, your mental arithmetic capabilities. So you sort of, I'm not saying you do this totally consciously, maybe sometimes, but I think even unconsciously you're doing this all the time, okay? And so if there's any disturbance in your estimates of the cost or the benefits, that could lead to difficulties or sort of maladaptive deployments of control. And so this is sort of a tree we're starting to bark up in understanding pathology. I wish I could tell you something more illuminating or insightful about what I think the disturbances are. I have some thoughts, but none of them are particularly well formed. But I think we have a framework now for considering the problem in a way that people hadn't really thought about it before.
So if I may just ask one brief question. Can you give an example of a psychiatric or neurological disorder that would uncouple these shared representations in a way that would appear that way anyway?
Well, so again, these are just musings. It's been a long time since I've actively thought that I could say anything about psychiatric disorders. I got burned trying to do that early on, and I'd like to think I was smart enough not to try again too soon. But I do think maybe the time is right to start doing that. So, fair question. Well, one possibility is that, I don't know if this is exact answer to your question, but it's an excuse to answer another one that may be close in spirit. We thought, and I have thought for decades, that schizophrenia is associated with a failure of control. And again, we sort of blame the messenger, right? We thought, oh, well, that must be because there's frontal damage in schizophrenia. And there is some evidence for that, but it's not overwhelming. And I'm thinking from this perspective that something else may be going on. What if the damage was more diffuse, and what it was doing was causing what were separated representations, because they're getting noised up or degraded, to be more similar? So it's sort of reversing the trend of automation and representational separation that allows you to be sort of precise and fluid and allow you to multitask, right? And starts making representations more and more shared. Well, what would that mean? If the system were adapting rationally to that, it would invest more control in trying to deal with the situation, because as representations become shared, more control is needed. But if the system has no control over that, and it's being asked to do more and more of that, we're basically tapping it beyond its capability. And so one possibility is that you could get a control-like deficit in schizophrenia from a mechanism that's totally distributed and has nothing to do with the control system. The control failure is a reflection of an adaptation to some other perturbation that's causing a problem that control knows how to solve within boundaries. And it's happening beyond the point at which the control system can solve it, and so that's when you get full breakdown. So I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but, sorry?
Yeah, good. That's fascinating. That's great. Time for one last question. Ulata, I think your hand's up there. Stand up, please.
So I'm trying to think, so this is obviously very interesting. I'm trying to think of, I know not following up on the question, is there any like animal model test, behavioral test that's analogous to the Stroop test or some of these other tests that we can begin to use to probe this?
That's a great question. As far as I know, nobody, and this may just be my ignorance, but as far as I know, nobody has actually studied multitasking per se in animal species. And I've talked with my colleagues like Carlos Brody and Tim Bushman about trying to do this. And they blanch. I think they're interested, but how do you teach a rat to do two things at once? Maybe a monkey's easier, but then you're talking about years worth of investment and effort. So we've been thinking about this. There are a couple of possibilities. So there is, I don't know how many of you people how many of you have tracked the sort of decision-making literature and the use of accumulation to bound or drift diffusion models of decision-making. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but those models are built on tasks that lend themselves very naturally to looking at different representations. So far, they've done the inverse. They've said, listen, so Bill Newsom's group, for example, had a paper a few years ago. I'm embarrassed, I'm forgetting the first author's name. But what they showed is that the information that encodes the moving dots in one of these tasks, which you're supposed to sort of respond to, so if the coherence of the dots the coherent dots are moving mostly to the left, you hit the left bar, or you look left, and conversely to the right. You can also have them, the task, depend on the color of the dots rather than the movement. And now you can look at what neural systems are representing the color information that would command a response in the color task as opposed to the movement information that would command the response in the movement task. And what they found was, in fact, both sources of information were being coded in the same fields. I think these were probably parietal fields if it was from the Newsom's lab, right? And that it simply had to do with how the information was projected down onto a manifold that led to the response that determined which task the animal was actually doing, right? But if you invert that and say, well, look, both of those sources of information are there now. What if we were train the animal to use both sources for different purposes, which in principle should be easy to do. I mean, we can do that in a laboratory with people. So if we could train animals in their task with their electrode arrays, looking at what has already been shown to be the neurons that have both sources of information, that was the point of their paper, we could start to look at whether, to the extent that the information is shared by those same units, the animal can't, or there's a fancy way of saying it, but I won't, can't do multitasking. But as you train them, sort of the representations separate out. It doesn't have to be different neurons, right? It develops a manifold that carves the space into separate places, right, with the same neurons. As long as there's enough, you can sort of, the brain and with machines, we can do fancy tricks to use the same, but the key is that the manifolds have to be different. And so it starts out with the same manifold and they can't multitask, but then you show through training, you develop separate manifolds that can be independently controlled, they can multitask. That would be evidence in support of this favor. So I think there are preparations that could be adapted to this purpose. I don't think it's going to be easy, but if you have any interest in trying, let me know.
Great. Please join me in thanking Dr. Cohen.